making that god-awful Snow White movie. Here's my version of a Snow White story. We would open on a cold winter's day, snow blanketing a beautiful castle, and you can hear the cries of an infant. In the queen's arms is her daughter. She herself looks weak and feverish. The king is by her side. The king looks at his daughter and notices that her pupils are a striking white. The baby was born with cataracts. Advisors and hands of the king essentially try to say, well, you're gonna need to try again, like this is an unsuitable heir, which the king rebukes all of them and says, this is my daughter. His wife, mumbling that their baby has snow white eyes, then passes from hemorrhaging because this is medieval times. King decides to name his daughter Snow White after his wife's last words. Then makes the kingdom itself a lot more welcoming and accommodating to, disabled individuals. You would see a montage of Snow White being raised in the castle, her growing up, her learning how to navigate the world, and eventually her father being remarried. A lot of his advisors and the men of court are essentially saying, like, oh, you can try to have a son with this one, to which he refuses. He declares that after he passes and Snow White comes of age, she will be the ruler. Of course, we have the introduction of the evil queen. Because Snow White herself is blind, she can't see, things like appearances do not matter to her. She's never been able to see, so, the queen tries to instill insecurities in her, but Snow White just, doesn't get it. And really doesn't care. Because she can't judge based on appearances, she has to go off of people's words. She has to go off their actions. So I have it explicitly stated the only reason the king remarried was to get his advisors off of his back. And he's like, look, married now, leave me alone. Evil queen, of course, has her witchy ways and talks to her mirror, to which the mirror is like, yeah, Snow White's gonna usurp you in terms of being the prettiest of all pretty. And that is because her beauty is not just skin deep. Queen poisons the king and takes the throne for herself because technically Snow White's not old enough yet. She has all the advisors killed, she reverses all of the accommodations and throws out anyone with any sort of disability and or physical difference from the king. When it comes to Snow White, the queen says, oh, well, you're blind, so you should just stay in your room. Of course, Snow White sneaks out because she's like, you're not my mom. Snow White especially really loves going to the gardens, so I'd have it that the queen explicitly makes the gardens get rearranged and changed every few months, just so Snow White will, get lost and potentially hurt herself. But Snow White is a very beloved princess, so even though the servants change everything, they make sure to give Snow White a map of the new layout. This, of course, vexes the queen. Today, Snow White is navigating the gardens with her little braille map, and a prince shows up. Of course, Snow White doesn't know he's a prince, but he's nice, and he notices her eyes, and she explains to him, like, oh, I was born with these, and my mother's last words were Snow White, so my dad named me that. It's a very cute interaction, and she talks about going to the wishing well, saying that her servants didn't mark it on the map. This makes the prince realize, like, oh, this is the princess, and he had been told by the queen, because he's there on like an envoy trade sort of situation, that the princess essentially has to be entombed in a room because she can't be trusted, and the queen's like, oh, she's hideous and feeble-minded and blah blah. So the Prince and Snow White spend the afternoon, like, walking through the gardens and finding the wishing well, to which Snow White makes a wish. She wishes to find happiness like she had with her father, and the prince says that he might be able to help with that. Before he can, like, propose a courtship or anything, they are interrupted by the queen's huntsman. I should say the huntsman was initially one of the hands of the king who, could get dirty work. And the queen saw him as useful, so she didn't have him killed with the others. But she did have him demoted. However, he's been there since the king was around, watched Snow White grow up, and has a soft spot for her, but feigns loyalty to the queen. The prince then meets with the queen, to which he says, I want to court Snow White and eventually marry her. We could merge our two kingdoms. It'll be fantastic. The queen denies this, still running with her lie that Snow White's in, like, no condition to, like, be married or have any sort of authority, to which the prince is like, well, I just met her, and she seems great. So, the queen then tells the prince that she will consider his offer and for him to go back to his kingdom. The prince essentially holds the trade agreement that their kingdoms are doing over her head and is like, don't be sneaky. So, because this powerful prince wants to marry Snow White, which would make Snow White rise in authority and she would lose her throne, combined with the fact that Snow White is about to be the fairest of them all, and the fact that she's about to come of age, the queen is like, I need to kill her. So essentially, like, the coming of age is like 21 in this realm. frozen rule. So the queen tells the huntsman, who she thinks is like completely loyal to her, hey, we need to make this look kind of like an accident. Like, she's blind, so you can just take her to the woods and like push her off something. The huntsman's like, sure, totally. So he takes Snow to the woods and is like, you need to run. Snow White's like, I'm blind, help me out a bit. The huntsman gives her a map of the woods, which she uses to go and find the dwarves. The huntsman reveals that, you know, he used to be friends with the dwarves before the queen locked down the kingdom. Also reveals that the kingdom is having financial issues because, you know, the queen is super opulent and spending all the damn money like Marie Antoinette, and because one of their largest exports, which was precious gems and metals, has kind of been stopped because the dwarves primarily controlled those operations and could get into the mines. Like, they had the skill and the stature. And, you know, when the queen was like, man, they were like, fuck you, we'll take our rubies elsewhere. So using the map, Snow White, like, navigates the forest. Of course, it gets spooky. That is until she hears familiar voices. And it's then Snow White realizes, like, oh, I know the dwarves, but she never knew that, like, they were dwarves. She goes to them, and the dwarves are like, oh my gosh, you've gotten so big, because, you know, for years they were locked out of the kingdom, and they were like, oh, do you remember us? And she's like, yes, I remember your voices. You guys used to play with me. We used to hang out. They were essentially her fun uncles that would give her diamonds. Huntsman goes back to the castle and is like, hey, I pushed her off a cliff. And the queen's like, goody goody gumdrops. So she goes to her mirror, and the mirror's like, she's not dead. And the queen's like, kill the huntsman. So she's like, I guess I gotta take matters into my own hands. Snow White and the dwarves, meanwhile, are having the time of their lives. She's in the mines with them. Her hearing is, like, superb. So when the dwarves tap a gemstone, she can tell, like, the differences in them. And they're like, this tap means ruby. This tap means diamond. Like, that sort of thing. Because, you know, it's kind of dark. It's a mine. So they'll just, like, knock on something and she'll be like, diamond. Emerald. I'd have it be revealed through conversations that a lot of the people that were thrown out of the kingdom by the evil queen either died along the way or made it to the prince's kingdom. Snow White then thinking, like, oh, if I could just get to that kingdom and talk to somebody, like, maybe they could help me, like, claim my throne. And she asked the dwarves, like, why didn't you guys, you know, leave? And they're like, well, you were still here. What do you got? 7 cool-ass uncles is what I'm saying. And also, they thought, like, well, soon you were gonna be of age, and, you know, then everything will become better again. I also talk about how the queen is telling everybody lies about Snow White. Like, it wasn't just the prince, it was kind of like the whole kingdom, but the dwarves know better because they, you know how she is. So the prince ends up coming back with a whole envoy and is like, hey, where's Snow White? And the queen is like, oh, she wandered off into the woods. And the prince is like, I don't fucking believe it. And the queen's like, oh, we're actually sending out search parties. Can you just, like, give us a minute? And the prince is like, I'm gonna give you, like, 3 days to send out a search party, and if y'all people don't find anything, then my people gonna find something. So the queen is on crunch time, so she does the whole, like, hag redress and goes to the dwarf's house where, for that day, like, Snow White decided to stay home. George deserves a break. But the queen comes, but Snow White recognizes her voice. And also she can smell that the apple is off. So I'd have it that Snow White takes a bite, but that she doesn't actually swallow it. And waits for a moment and then kind of like play collapses. Of course, this isn't revealed till a little bit after. And the queen cackles like, haha, I win, all that bullshit, and goes back to her kingdom. Snow White spits the apple out. Like, she's sick from it, but she's not dead. The dwarves come home and they help her out, and they all go back to her kingdom because, you know, the queen mentioned the prince and his kingdom's name, to which Snow White's like, oh, that's the kingdom that accepted everybody, like, I need to go get him before he leaves. So the queen's plan was to kill Snow White in the dwarves' house, go back, get an envoy to come kick down the dwarves' home, because she knew, like, they weren't just gonna, like, toss her body to the wilderness, and essentially frame them for murder. So she's going on this long spiel before the prince, like, oh, we have to send reinforcements and send your army too so you can see the body so you don't blame me. And that's when Snow White comes in and is like, hey, you bitch, you tried to kill. Queen's like, I'm caught, I might as well get my last lick in, tries to kill Snow White, but Snow White stabs her in the heart. Prince and Snow White get married, true love's kiss reinvigorates the kingdoms. Kingdom becomes accommodating again, Snow White gets her happily ever after, and the queen is in a pauper's grave because fuck that bitch. Of course, the dwarves are now the new hands of the king and queen. The end.